Hi, this is Elisabeth Hancock, host of The Great Awakening. So this week we're going to be looking at part 2 of what we were looking at last week with the Nummo and the Jackal and the self-fertilizing leaf. And we're going to be moving on to the Great Mother and a one-world civilization, because we can see physical evidence of this. And when we can see physical evidence, it means that we cannot ignore it. So I've been sort of sifting through what all of this could mean. And this is what this week is about. So moving on, as we looked at last week, the Numu and the Anuna are probably the same people. So the Numu of the Dogon tribe, who were said to be an amphibian serpent humanoid species, a spiritual being, if you like, that came from the Pleiades and possibly manifested itself as this amphibian serpent or reptile lizard looking species. And according to the Dogon accounts, this was a physical being. They came here in a metal craft, and it's a physical being, which is interesting in itself. We saw last week that the Numu, the Dogon tribe stories, linked to the Mesopotamian stories and also linked to the Abrahamic religion, so the patriarchs. And we know that something changed. We can see that something altered. And this could be the feminine, the divine feminine. And it also could be the origins of humans. So as we talked about last week, the Gnostic texts say that the female was the first one to be created. And then a mate was created for her. And we could see this as the Adam and Eve story. The Nummu, the Dogon stories, also say that the female was created first, and that is because they are a feminine androgynous species. They see themselves as a feminine species, and they created Lib, the self-fertilizing Lib, who then went on to create all of humanity that we have today. Now, although I don't think that timelines actually add up, I do think it's interesting to look at some sort of timeline just to give us a general idea. And we know from the Sumerian Kings list that it says that the gods came here 241,200 years before the Great Flood, and is when the kingship or divine rulers began. So there is one female ruler listed in this list, but it's essentially a patriarch list, a king's list. We can also see in the Abrahamic religions that, again, it's a patriarch. It's centered around kings. The genealogies look at the genealogies of the male, not the female. But it's interesting because we have the different bloodlines of the rulers written in the king's list, and we also have the genealogies in the Bible as well, showing that they are trying to show that these were important people, that they were the ruling families of that time. And once again, not really showing that it's a religious document. However, one interesting thing to note, and that is that the Anunnaki did not use time in the same way that we do. And a Shah was one day for the Anunnaki. So essentially, we need to be dividing 241,200 years by 365. So that is 365 days in a year, which means that this is actually only 660 years before a great flood. If these timelines are true, then it means that the rulers only ruled for 79 years after the flood. That makes it a total of 739 years ago, making it only 1283 AD. So the Dogon tribe say that the Nummu have been visiting them since the 13th century, which sort of is around the same time period. But the Dogon, the Nummu, I feel originally came here as a feminine, female-orientated race, and possibly the patriarchs came in and altered things. We can certainly see that a lot has been altered here. The Book of Dryan also says that a race of serpent beings descended from the sky after a great flood. And there have been many great floods here, 8,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. But there has also been some quite recent catalytic events as well, such as a mud flood, which may have been the mid to late 1700s or early 1800s. We also have in the Bible the Watchers descended and they married human females, seeming to show that they were all males themselves. We know that these females then gave birth to the Nephilim, and the Nephilim were said to be the sons of the Watchers and the human females. And they seemed to be giants and caused a lot of chaos and were cannibals often as well. And interestingly, a flood was created to wipe them out, or at least that's what it says in the Bible. But we can see that the world is littered with giant bones, skeletal remains of giants, which cross every single continent. And some of these giant bones, they've got double rows of teeth, they've got horns. Some of them even have armor, wearing armor. But the ancient texts also talk about how humans lived alongside a race of tall giants as well. And we seem to sort of live together side by side for quite some time. In our British myth stories, we have King Albion, who was said to be a king of the British Isles and was a red-haired giant. And they were said to live for thousands of years and often said to be immortal. But they could also be killed in war, because some have been found buried in graves, complete, still with their armor on and their swords, holding their swords. Now, whilst I've been looking at these different time periods and timelines, and we know that timelines do not add up, and we don't really know why, but it got me thinking around the Nummo being spiritual beings, that humans are obviously spiritual beings. We now know that everything is made of energy, that everything is made up of frequencies. And in a sense, different worlds, different realms are different frequencies, and Earth has its own frequency as well. And I'm wondering if the old world was actually more etheric than we are now, meaning that our consciousness has been trapped into a limited or lower consciousness thinking, understanding. And interestingly, one of the main things that I think would trap our consciousness into linear or limited thinking could be time. And this may be why timelines and time periods just don't add up, because the previous civilization, or the old world, was far more etheric and other dimensional than we are now. Certainly other dimensions are talked about in our ancient texts, and beings and entities from other dimensions, and what we call God. So we know that the people in our past would talk to the gods all the time, and the gods were physical beings. They would talk back. They seem to have physical form. But I suspect that this is because the time period in the past was more etheric, and because of that, we were able to see far more of consciousness, of reality, of the visible light spectrum than we can see now. So again, looking at time here, the Dogon tribe say the Numu have been visiting them since the 13th century, but they use masks to count this time period, not time themselves. We know that our ancient ancestors, or the indigenous people, they use the sky to track time. They use the sun and the moon to track time. In the Western world, we are the ones with watches. And as time doesn't really make sense in terms of our ancient texts, and the indigenous people don't seem to talk about time in the same way that we do, I am wondering if perhaps that time is not even relevant at all, and these different civilizations, different empires, different worlds are actually different dimensions. We also know that the Numu were part of Atlantis too. Atlantis is always said to be about 12,000 years ago, and that may be the case, but that shows us that the Numu came here before that. If we think about ourselves as a multidimensional world, which is a spiritual realm, we could call it. It doesn't mean it's not physical, but it's spiritual as well, because it's made of energy. So if we think about our world as being made of energy, possibly existing in different frequencies within that, different timelines within that, different dimensions within that, then it got me thinking that maybe this is how the Numu form manifested itself in the earth plane. So in their own spiritual realm of the Pleiades, they possibly looked different. But when they manifested here in this earth plane, they manifested as this particular serpent mermaid being. We also last week talked about the Jackal, and the Jackal was the being that the Numu made by accident. And when they were creating the female of the species, then they created the male to go alongside the female, but they created the Jackal. who was born with no connection to spirit or soul. Shannon Dory, who we looked at last week, believes that Yahweh could be the Jackal. And we know that Yahweh is in the Old Testament, but this may well just be a title, because in the True Book of Enoch by Billy Myers, Yahweh is said to be a human who governs through love, knowledge, wisdom, truth, and perfection. Or he is not creation. He is not to be worshipped. He is to govern using laws that arise from creation. And as we can see with natural law, the original Bible was a legal document because it's still being used today with natural law. And I'll do another podcast on natural law because it's a very interesting area, and it's a law or legal framework that we can actually use today in order to exit ourselves from the corrupt common law that we have in our world today. So in the True Book of Enoch, Enoch talks about how gods are humans, not creation, and they live all over the universe. But the universe is a spiritual place of other dimensions. So when I talk about spiritual, I'm sort of talking about invisible or other dimensional energy, energetic. But I also connect that to heart as well, which allows me to connect to the higher realms, the higher dimensions, higher consciousness, as indeed it does with all of us. So in my understanding, different worlds hold different frequencies, but they are physical in their expression. They can be physical. I do believe, looking at the old world architecture and looking at the amount of myth stories, the different beings and creatures that we had and actually still have in our world, it does show me that we are looking at a multidimensional reality here. We are not looking at a fixed, linear, one-dimensional reality, which we could call materialism. And that's the reality that we're being pushed into now. But in fact, we are not this one-dimensional reality. We are far bigger than this. And that's because everything is consciousness. You may also remember from my second book that we talked about our ancestors, the luminous and light beings. And I've done a couple of podcasts about this as well. But our ancestors, who essentially were more luminous and shining than we are now, they hardly ate, or they just lived on fruit. And they also lived for many, many more years than us, possibly because they were more etheric than we are. And as they participated more in human life and ate the food and maybe married different people, they began to become more dense, and they lost their luminosity. They lost their luminous light. And at the beginning, they were described as shining like the stars. And again, this seems to show that they originally came here from what we would probably say a higher dimension, a higher consciousness. And we can see here are some of the pictures that we looked at last week. We've got the mermaids, we've got the Melocene here, which is like the Starbucks logo. And the Melocene, many of the European royal houses are said to stem from this Melocene sea monster. And we've also got here these different serpent, reptile, lizard-looking beings. And these figures, they are really all over our world. And it begs the question, are these actual physical beings that they are depicting here? Or are these spiritual beings that they can see in their own mind sight and not actually see physically? And it got me thinking that, well, possibly that is the same thing. So what we are able to see now with our mind sight, and I teach intuitive development, so we use our mind sight a lot. And what we're able to see with our mind sight, possibly in the past, they were able to see with their own eyes because they could see more of the visible light spectrum. And then we have here the Ubaid statues, and we can see this is what Shannon Dory is showing us what the male of the species, the male Numu, looked like. And you can see all these bubbly things, which in fact the Dogon people, they tattooed markings on their body in the same places where these people had these bubbly things. They also have the elongated skull, and we certainly know that the elongated skull has been copied around the world. Every single continent had the different people who were using head binding to imitate this skull, this elongated skull. But we also know, and if you read my second book, you'll see this, we also know that there have been many other elongated skulls found around the world as well, seeming to show that these humans, because in fact that the mother's side is human, the father's side is not, but seeming to show that they evolved in this way for some particular reason. And that reason may be that they were more spiritual. Because they were a more spiritual being, they use different parts of their brain. We use more of the neocortex, whereas they use more of the dream state, which means that they essentially have a different experience in the same physical world as us, but they have a very different experience to us. But we can see from the Nummo stories that we talked about last week that we were not created as a slave race, as Zecharia Sitchin says in his books. We essentially came here in spiritual form and then dropped into lower expressions of matter. That matter may have expressed itself as an amphibian serpent being because they were in etheric form, they were astral form, and then they became physical. They were shapeshifters, which also seems to evidence that they were able to change their form and express themselves in different way. And possibly in the past, when we were more etheric, we possibly expressed ourselves in different forms as well. Maybe because our genetics are still evolving, which is what Rudolf Steiner says. He talks of the blemmies, which we can see here. And Rudolf Steiner talks about these beings coming from Lemuria, when they were still more etheric and had not become the physical form that we are now. And that is because they had not entered into the I am consciousness, which is the mind and self. They essentially had no brain, so therefore they didn't have a head, and that's how they express themselves. The I am consciousness is also the Christ consciousness, which created individuality. And we'll look at that towards the end. In the last slide, we'll look again at Christ consciousness. But as we go into unity consciousness now, if you like, we're moving out of the individual consciousness and now moving into unity consciousness. And we're moving into this understanding that the gods are not outside of us anymore, that we are the gods, and the universe is not outside of us, that the universe is inside us. So our levels of consciousness are very much shifting into a new epoch, into a new parameter, a new way of defining our place in the universe and who we are as a species and as a collective. We can also physically see our DNA changing because our DNA is energetic. So as the energy changes, our DNA is changing as well. So we can see that evolution is a spiritual thing. And we know that we're moving into a new spiritual consciousness. We're moving into a new spiritual world. And we're moving out of materialism, materialistic thinking, and moving into the understanding that we are a spiritual being inhabiting what looks like a physical world, but it's actually not physical either. Now, if we think about the Jackal and the Abrahamic religions and Yahweh and all these different things we talked about last week, then we can see that the Abrahamic religions, the number one thing that they did for people is that they shifted people's thoughts and focus from the matriarch to the patriarch. And they began to alter the beliefs of the people by essentially altering their stories and books. But because they had to utilize the original beliefs, otherwise people would not follow it. And I work as an energy healer. I work with people all the time, helping them to change and shift their belief structures to ones that are more helpful for them in their life. And I can see that beliefs often don't change overnight. It is something that happens over a period of time. And we can see that the Bible has been altered hundreds of times. We can also see that our world seems to have gone through many resets, and each generation just seems to have sort of a little bit more skimmed off the top. And we can see with the old world that quite a lot happened then. And many of those old world buildings have been destroyed and are still being destroyed. And now, as we move into another new epoch, if you like, another new level of consciousness, we are moving into what's being called the space age and a one world government. But as we move into these different things, what are we losing? What are we losing behind? Are we losing our ancient history? Are we losing our stories of who we are? So as the historical and religious texts are rewritten, the Old Testament, the genealogies of Adam and Abraham in Genesis, track only the male lines. But we were a matriarchal society, which you'll see in a minute when we look at some pictures. We can also see in the book of Genesis that they have very odd practices. For example, Abraham's daughters got him drunk and then laid with him in order to get pregnant by him, essentially. And then the Lord God destroyed an entire city, killing thousands of people, which we know as the Sodom and Gomorrah stories. The Old Testament is full of genocide, wars, and murder, and these stories are said to go back thousands of years. But actually, natural law shows us a very different story. It shows us that as little as 963 AD, we were following a moral code that we intuitively knew. And natural law is also called God's law. So it seems when we look at the Abrahamic religions that the patriarchs did not have this moral code, and they seem to follow a different consciousness, which we could call a God. We can also see that 500 years ago, the church also began to make changes. They cut us off from inner earth, which is the subterranean cultures. They also cut us off from creation. So as we saw before, God is a human. Creation creates everything in the universe, and we are always connected to creation. We are always connected to source, what I call source these days. But the church created this very controlling and manipulative society where they essentially cut us off from creation and told us that we had to worship God through the church. I don't even think that these buildings, these church buildings, were created as churches. I feel that they were originally healing centers, which means that the church took over healing centers, took them on as places of worship, and then told the people of the land that they had to go into that church to worship and honor God. So we know that God was a human, or at least according to the True Book of Enoch by Billy Myers, God was a human. So who were people worshipping? Well, we know that they were worshipping Yahweh, but who was Yahweh? He could have been a multitude of different people, but one thing that he was a patriarch. And one thing that we can see in our world, or we will in a minute, is that our world was a matriarchal society, and the patriarch took over. According to the research of Margaret O'Connor, and she's someone I interviewed on my podcast a few years ago, she discovered that Mary was the original priest, and that females have essentially been taken out of the Bible since before 1900. So by the 1900s, or 1903 or something, 1910, I think she might have said, there were no more references to females in the Bible. We also know from last week that the original beliefs, the paganism and the Gnostic beliefs, that they also included the female in their beliefs. And the Abrahamic religions altered this. We can see from the Sumerian kings list as well, that seemed to be highly revolved around the masculine energy. So we can see that something happened there and altered it, upset the balance of things in our world, because the balance of things is masculine and feminine energy. So from an energetic point of view, if you take the feminine energy out, it actually creates a huge distortion and it creates an imbalance. Because if we think about our realm being a spiritual realm, being an etheric realm, and an etheric realm which is created through imagery and statues and visions and paintings and cave art and all these sorts of expressions which create literally this physical realm, we can see how taking out the female would have a massive effect on that. If you read my second book, we can also see that the tablets of destinies that the Anunnaki use, the gods and goddesses as they were called, they use these tablets of destinies, which essentially allowed them to use magic. These tablets of destinies were symbols like nuclear code sort of things, which essentially altered reality. And that's why I have a feeling that this reality is a holographic reality, because we can see also the sacred geometry everywhere. Sacred geometry makes up our entire world. It makes up nature, it makes up the human body, and it also made up our old world architecture, seeming to show that we worked in a very different way in the past to how we work now. So if we think about using magic in this realm, and as an energy healer, I do feel that working with energy is probably what we called magic. But there is black magic, just as there is white magic. And there are possibly some people in this world who are using black magic to steer human consciousness in the way that they want to steer it. I know that the bankers are always saying whoever controls the money controls the world, but actually it's whoever controls human consciousness controls the world. They know that human consciousness collectively creates reality. And now we do as well, so we can start shifting it back in our favor, and also shifting it back to the understanding that we are not confined to linear thinking, that we are most likely a multidimensional species ourselves, living in what I feel is a multidimensional reality. There's different levels of that reality. I think we only have to look at the blemmy, the top left-hand corner there, to see how could a being have lived in this world without a head, without a brain? How could that have happened? How could he walk? How could he use his arms? How could he eat? For us, this has to be myth because it makes no logical sense to how we work today. But if we understand that we are a spiritual or etheric being ourselves, and all the confinements of the physical body, which have created many limiting beliefs for us as a species, all of this seems to trap us into a very narrow, limited way of living and being. I feel it's creating a lot of health issues for people. It's creating worldwide depression, and it's also keeping us trapped in very miserable jobs, very controlled living, which is not how the human spirit is supposed to live. So we've been looking at the patriarch here, and we're now going to look at the Great Mother. We know from last week that the Mother Goddess imagery can be traced back 20,000 years, and statues and representations have been discovered running from the Pyrenees to Siberia. And this also includes the Ubaid statues of what Shannon Dory believes to be the Nummu from the Dogon tribe. So it's in the book by Anne Baring and Jules Cashford, who have researched the Mother Goddess imagery, and they're the ones who discovered it goes back 20,000 years. I know that carbon dating isn't correct, but I can also see that many of these statues are incredibly old looking. So I think that some of these go all the way back to a certain time period when we were honoring the Divine Mother. And one of these is the Magna Mater. The Magna Mater is said to have originated in Anatolia, Phrygia, and spread from there. But we can see that the Anatolian Great Mother has pagan symbols on her. So this is the Anatolian Great Mother here, and down here. And this one here, this is taken from one of the courtyards in the Vatican. So we can see here, why have the Vatican got this Magna Mater with pagan symbols all over it? We also know that the paganism was connected to the Numu. But we can also see that paganism really was one of the original beliefs, and it also linked to the Celts and to animism as well, which looks at how everything is alive, everything is living, it all has a consciousness. I think many of us who are more spiritually inclined these days can see that the same thing, that everything has a consciousness, everything is alive. And I think that this explains so many things in our world that we don't understand. It explains interdimensional beings. It explains plasma craft, UFOs. It explains the old world and how it was built. It explains multidimensionality, portals. I mean, just so many different things when we consider that consciousness is everything. And this paganism seemed to be this sort of consciousness where it honored the female, the matriarch. And we can also see that the Nummu symbols were also connected to the ancient Egyptians, that they all seem to be linked in some way. And that is why many researchers think that we had a one-world civilization. There's certainly a lot of compelling evidence. And if you want to learn more about this, and you can look at the work of Michelle Gibson and Bridget Knapp, who are two of the Tartaria conference speakers that you can find on my YouTube channel. But is very interesting what they're saying, because it really does look like we had a one world civilization that were all linked through architecture, free energy, or technologies that revolved around free energy, or at least not fossil fuels. They had linked water systems. They seemed to power their cities using possibly water systems and free energy systems. They seemed to utilize sound frequency, sacred geometry, cymatics in a way that we really have forgotten about today. They used it in their buildings and also their gardens as well. And we know that we can use certain geometric shapes to enhance the growth of our plants. So they understood how all of this worked, and they showed that the previous civilization, the old world, was far more advanced than we are today. But these images also seem to show that it was a matriarchal society, which is very, very interesting. We can also see this image down here. This is Sibyl when the Romans tried to invade, and they took the Magna Mater imagery to Rome. And, we can see this one here is in the Vatican. So they took that to Rome because one of the Romans had apparently had some sort of a vision where they decided that if they took that imagery, then they would be more successful in their domination of the land. But we can also see here, there are lions. So as we talked about last week, we have the self-fertilizing Lebe that's also shown with the lions and linked to the Pleiades. And we can see on her arm here, there are lions. These are lions walking up her arm. We can see here, this is the Roman version of the Magna Mater, which is Sibyl, the lions here. The Romans are said to have adopted the Magna Mater 204 BC. And then the Magna Mater then became Sibyl. But the story of Attis and Sibyl is a story of incest, castration, transgender, and blood sacrifice, and can be seen in the imagery of eunuchs and bulls. Here we can see that this is where the Magna Mater is supposed to have originated, Anatolia, and we'll look at Anatolia and Phrygia in a minute because that's another interesting area of the world. But it essentially moved into all of Europe. We can see here it revolves around all of Europe here, and then moved into to Italy, apparently via the Romans. And I'm not convinced that the Romans and the Greeks are really who we think they are. So if perhaps we consider that it wasn't taken into Rome, but it in fact already was in Rome. It was already an important part of all these different countries because they were already honoring the mother goddess. If we pull the story of Sibyl and Attis apart, we find some very interesting aspects of it, which shows some sort of inversion or misunderstanding of some sort. First of all, Attis and Mithras and Horus, but we'll come back to Horus later, but Attis and Mithras make up the Jesus story that we see in the New Testament. We know that the Romans took 45 books out of the Old and New Testament in supposedly 325 BC when they edited it. And they did a lot. They took a lot out, a lot of all the sort of the mystical stuff, which they felt was too mystical for people. And of course, by taking that out, they took out, I think, the etheric knowledge, the spiritual knowledge. But what is even more interesting about Mithras and Attis is that they both wore the Phrygian cap. Now we can see that the Magna Mater started out in Phrygia. We're told that the Phrygian cap is said to signify freedom. And that's why it was seen at the Olympics, we can see here, and why it was also seen in the French Revolution, that it was signifying freedom. But we can also see it here. And this is a serf or servant to the king. And this Phrygian cap, it just seems to come up all over the place. We can see it here on a coin. When you track the Phrygian cap, which Dr. Lee Merritt has done, but when you track this cap, it really is all over the place. And what is so interesting about this part of the world is that they're very linked to the Khazarians. So we can see here Khazaria. The Khazarians, also known as the Ashkenazi Jews, and it's interesting it's got the word Nazi in there. I always find that fascinating. But they come from Anatolia or Phrygia, and they have a different origin to the Hebrew Jews. So Judaism, as Islam and Christianity, are all said to be patriarchal, and they form the Abrahamic religions because they all include the same books in there. I never thought that religion per se is a problem, because it's just a set of beliefs. And if people want to live by a certain set of beliefs that don't harm anyone else and allow them to find happiness and health in life, I don't see there's any problem with that at all. The problem that we have with today's religion is that it's being used to murder so many people and cause so many wars. It's just been totally inverted. But what the Abrahamic religions also show is that they are linked to the patriarchy. The Khazarians are also supposed to be, their original belief or religion, or whatever you want to call it, is actually revolves around child sacrifice and satanic ritual. They were actually in between so many different countries, and the countries got fed up of them taking their children to use for these different sacrifice and rituals. And they were told to choose another faith, and they decided to choose Judaism. They decided to choose that as their faith. So rather than Islam or Christianity, they chose Judaism. So in a sense, they became Jews through religion rather than place, which is why they have a different origin. But if we understand that their original religion was one that practiced child sacrifice, satanic ritual, and there are many researchers today who believe that they did not give up their religion. They just pretended to take on a new religion and actually continued with their original religion, which was obviously worshipping some sort of God that was not what many of us would call God. And if we think about the True Book of Enoch again, where he talks about what we call gods are humans, and the only one God is creation. And this is creation, it creates everything. And I have always felt that nature is the physical manifestation of creation that just keeps creating, creating, creating. And if that's the case, then it would also mean that the human body is also the physical manifestation of creation. And also, the old world architecture is also the physical manifestation of creation. So it seems that the people in our past were able to access creation, the energy of creation, in a way that would build their world. And I suspect that we're moving back into this level of consciousness now. As you know, I'm an energy healer myself. I work with source energy, earth energy, different energies from all over the place, and they really do work. And I do feel that there's an energetic aspect of our world that we need to remember, we need to get back to if we want to become healthy and happy again. And I don't think it's as hard as we think it is, but we definitely need to be doing inner work to get to that. We need to be clearing our childhood wounds, clearing past life wounds, these sorts of things, or even karma, past life karma. Once we've cleared all of this and we connect ourselves to source, to creation, the higher realms, a higher consciousness of the universe, if you like, life certainly becomes an awful lot better. So these Khazarians could well be linked to the Phrygian cap. And as we track this Phrygian cap, we do find that it seems to be linked to some very interesting areas. We also know that Sybil was known as the Virgin Goddess. And this Virgin Goddess we were talking about last week because of the self-fertilizing androgynous female line of Lieb. We know that originally we could be seen as a self-fertilizing female. Whether this is linked to the Nummu, who knows? But we are still able to practice this self-fertilization today, which is called parthenogenesis. And according to Dr. Joe Blair, who died in the 1990s, in the 1700s, women were still practicing parthenogenesis, and it was actually outlawed. There were so many women practicing it, it was outlawed. And Joe Blair believes that this may be what the real reason for the witch burnings was. But I also know from interviewing Margarita Riglioso that women can still do it today. We still have the ability today to be able to self-fertilize, which is very interesting because only lizards and snakes can do that in our world. So how come human females also have that ability? Sybil's son, Attis, was said to be born on the 25th of December to the Virgin Nana. Nana is the goddess from the Mesopotamian texts, again showing that they are all connected. She was a virgin because she was also the self-fertilizing Nummu. And we know that Mary was the Virgin Mother, so Mary and Jesus, and we'll come back to that towards the end. But they're all linked. These stories are all linked. We can see that these stories in the New Testament, they do seem to be heavily linked to Greek and Roman stories. And it does sort of feel like the Roman priests, the Jesuits, these different priests sort of just were sort of cobbling together lots of different stories that they got from other older texts in order to create some sort of biblical book to allow them to alter the belief structures of the people. So the people, I think, probably had already been using these books. We know that natural law can be found in the New Testament, and it's also called God's law. They were already using this. It is a legally binding document still in the courts of law today. And the reason it's legally binding is because it is linked to God, essentially. So it cannot be refused or refuted. So it is a book that was being used. So they knew that they could only alter the beliefs of the people if they used the original book and then edited and took things out and added things in order to hijack the consciousness of the people, which is what they did. They changed the matriarchal society to a patriarchal society, and that had a massive knock-on effect on the people themselves and society. We can still see it today in this very masculine society that we live in. In the story of Sybil and Attis, Attis was the only begotten son and savior slain for salvation of mankind, which of course is again the Jesus story of rebirth. Now, it really got me thinking, could the original story again be the self-fertilizing Nummu, who rebirthed itself and essentially created a new being, a new clone of themselves, if you like? But the Mesopotamian texts interpreted this as a god that was slain and the ghost of the god brought into the body of the new being of the human in order to not forget the god. So are they describing here maybe the process of parthenogenesis? I do also question the idea of eating the flesh of Jesus, drinking his blood. I do question this because it just really doesn't feel at all uplifting, and it feels very much more linked to the Khazarians with their child sacrifice and satanic ritual. Again, linking to the Anatolia Phrygian cap. And of course, we do wonder very much about the Catholics. Who exactly are those people in the Vatican? Why were they able to create their place, the Vatican, as a city? How did they get so much power? How is it that they're dripping in gold and yet, they could solve poverty in one afternoon with the amount of money that they have, and yet they don't do that? So they're obviously a very political institution. So who exactly are these Catholics? Who exactly are these popes? Who exactly are the Vatican? And I've always wondered about that. And which god do they worship? So we've looked at the Great Mother in Europe, but what about Queen Victoria? Because she is very interesting, and the time period is very interesting as well. That time period of the 1800s when she supposedly ruled. So statues of Queen Victoria are everywhere. But was she Queen Victoria, or are these another Great Mother statue? Is this another form of the Great Mother? And unlike the Great Mother statues of the Magna Mater that are European based, this one goes all around the world. There are 175 statues worldwide and 75 paintings of her. And we can see here, this is the first statue. This is the earliest statue said to be a Queen Victoria in Cork, going back to 1849. Now we can see here, this looks nothing like Queen Victoria. She's dressed in very medieval costume. She is holding the orb in her hand, doesn't seem to have a scepter. She seems to have sort of a cross on her dress. She's got a very interesting crown, again, very medieval looking. So this really does look like it could have been a medieval queen. So what I'm seeing here is a cutting out of history, a cutting out of a queen a cutting out possibly of an empire, where I suspect that many more queens ruled than we are being told. We can see that Queen Victoria holds the scepter and the orb. And interestingly, the stories about her say that she apparently wrote 2,000 words every single day in her diary. And there were hundreds of these notebooks when she passed, apparently. But all of these notes are no longer around. So most were destroyed, apparently. And then the ones that survive are locked away and are no longer available to the public. But again, this constant altering of history, this constant denial of our history, of not being able to understand what's happened in our world, just this constant control, which again always makes me think of the Eye of Yahweh, the digital ID, this constant control that we have. And as we move into a digital ID, even more control. It is so limiting to human consciousness, which is essentially a spiritual form, an etheric form. To have that control, that continuous control going on, is very alien and very wrong, actually. And we can see with natural law that in the past, 1,000 years ago, if time is correct, but in the past, we did not have that level of control. People ruled themselves, they had tribal leaders, they had communities. Natural law was called God's law, and it was a people who followed, who understood intuitively how to feel into the heart in order to know how to live their lives, how to treat others. We are told constantly in today's world that we are evil, that we're bad, that we do things wrong, that we need to be controlled, we need to be punished. We're always being told this as a community, and yet our true historical texts show us that this is really not true. We can see that Queen Victoria ruled from 1837 to 1901. And here we have all the different countries where her statues have been. And it literally spans most of the world. But there were also other places where statues were removed. And they've also been paintings about her as well. Here are some more statues here. So this one down here, again, another medieval costume. And not looking anything like Queen Victoria. I really don't think that this one is her. Again, this statue here from Australia. This again, I don't think that this is Queen Victoria. I don't think it is either. But holding the scepter and the orb. So Queen Victoria may not have been what we think she is. And it may again be more of the Great Mother, more of the one world civilization, which seemed to honor the matriarch, as we can see with all these different statues. And then these later statues that came in, maybe they are something different. I do feel that this statue up here looks very much like Winston Churchill, which again is interesting in itself. Now, if we think about the time period that Queen Victoria is said to have ruled, so from 1837 to 1901, if we look at the inventions that occurred in that time period, and there was an explosion of technology during this period. Between 1790 and 1840, there were 11,500 patented inventions. Then from 1840 to 1900s, which is exactly the same time period as Queen Victoria ruled, practically, there were 682,000 patented inventions. What is the likelihood of this? Things like the battery, the telegraph, sewing machine, telephone. We've got the light bulb. We can see here this World Fair here lit up, supposedly before the light bulb came out. This is showing that this is advanced lighting that they've got here. We've also got the photography as well, which is very interesting because it means that we don't have any imagery captured before then, supposedly. Here, I've put in some of the pictures here of the World Fairs, which I think once you've had a look at all the World Fairs around the world in every single city, and you look at just the staggering beauty of the buildings, the height of the buildings. Look at this gold statue here, which the gold statue, I believe, is still there, but the buildings have gone. Look at this one here from Brussels, 1910. I mean, just look at that. Look at the waterways. A lot of these buildings still remain in places like Paris, Milan, London. There still are many of these old world buildings. And we also have here, so Rome, the capital of Italy, became the capital of Italy in 1871, which is very interesting in itself. Look at that architecture. And then so many of these world fairs were knocked down. A few months later, a few years later, all gone. Said to have been made from papier-mâché and plaster casts and all these ridiculous things. Another one who could be a great mother is Britannia. There aren't early statues of her, but she comes up in the coins, again, making us ask, was she a queen? Was she a queen? Or was she the great mother? And we see this, the Lion of Lieb again. And I mean, this lion could be linked to something else, of course, but this lion comes up with the great mother all the time. She's also got a Roman-looking hat and tunic. And the Triton, Poseidon's Triton she's got, which is very interesting as well. And the Roman and Greek architecture that we see all over the place, is it perhaps original old world architecture, the old world, one world civilization, honoring the matriarch? Is this the old world architecture that they built? And thus the Romans and Greeks are not the people that we think they are. Certainly, if we think about the Romans being quite close to the Khazars, the Khazarians, and we think about the Vatican today and the Catholics and the 13 Illuminati families are supposed to be based in Italy. Nobody knows their real names, but we know that the Orsini family is one. They are linked to the Grey Pope, the Black Pope, the Grey Pope. And these are linked very much to secret societies who are running things from behind the scenes. And as I said, those who control consciousness controls reality. So we don't have to worry about what they're controlling or how much money they have or how many houses they have. What we have to do is claim back our consciousness. We have to keep saying, I do not consent. We have to teach our children to be critical thinkers so they can question the teachers when the teachers teach them things that are illogical. I remember sitting in my class at school and thinking, that doesn't make any sense. But the teachers, they don't question themselves. But my children say the same thing. They say, what the teachers say doesn't make any sense. And I say, yeah, then question it, question it. So here we have Britannia. We're being told that the Britannia statues, they start to form in the 17th century. But perhaps they were actually always there. So new statues are being built 18th, 19th century, apparently. She comes up on statues, on medals, on architecture, and also a British coin from 1672. Are these statues that have been built in the 17th century, 18th century, or are they just more examples of the Great Mother and the one world civilization that honored the matriarch? Because these just go around the entire world. So why would a patriarchal society that we can see from the Abrahamic religions, why would this patriarchal society have all of these matriarch, the Great Mother, the Virgin Goddess, statues, images all around the world? Why would they do that? Well, maybe because they couldn't wipe everything out. They couldn't just delete and destroy all the statues, and they started to create new statues in order for people to not question the original statues. So finally, we've got here, of course, the Madonna. Is this the Great Mother or the Virgin Goddess? Because the Madonna, Mary and Jesus, which began as Isis and Horus, but the Madonna is essentially the Virgin Queen, the Virgin Goddess. And this is very much linked to the Great Mother. And again, it's linked to the self-fertilizing Lieb, or at least the female that can practice parthenogenesis. Now, whether they're linked to the Nummu, who knows? But it's certainly a very big coincidence. Here we have this, just a few Madonna pictures here. But I think what really stands out for me is the fact that in some of these pictures, she's holding the scepter and the orb. And that shows that she is a queen. So again, we have more queens here, more queens who have perhaps been hidden by the patriarchs. Again, there are possibly too many statues to destroy. So essentially, things have been hijacked, and the patriarchal Abrahamic religions came in and left the Madonna, the Great Mother, the Madonna statues there, because they didn't have to delete these. They just had to change our belief structures around who they were, what they were. So instead of it being the Great Mother or the Virgin Goddess, it now becomes the Madonna, the Catholic Madonna. And the belief structures have been changed of the people. So to get the people to take on the new beliefs of the winners of the war, of the ruling elites, they didn't need to destroy everything. They just had to hijack our consciousness and make us believe a new story. In the work of Michelle Gibson from the Tartaria conference, she shows that the patriarchs didn't completely destroy our world. They just shifted the energy of it, and they altered consciousness by doing this, because they destroyed the ley lines and the many buildings that were on the ley lines. So fundamental buildings they couldn't destroy. You could see it a little bit like the chakras or the acupuncture points of the earth. You can't destroy certain parts of the earth because it would completely destabilize the rest of the earth and it would not be habitable to live on. So they destroyed what they could and they left what they had to. And I suspect this explains why there are some parts of the world that still have a lot of this old world architecture. And there are other parts of the world that just don't have any. For example, Dresden was completely bombed, destroyed after the war. Japan as well. Both of these places had a lot of old world architecture, but they were able to destroy these places because they possibly were not fundamental to the realm, if you like, and could therefore be destroyed. Michelle Gibson also shows that these ley lines are still there, and many of these different buildings have been built on the ley lines. We saw in Bridget Knapp's presentation a few weeks ago that she showed about ancient Egypt, that these different pyramids, that black pyramids had been created to invert and to turn the pyramid into black magic, if you like, and also that many of these ancient Egypt statues and images come up in the US showing that, again, America and ancient Egypt were linked in some way. We know that the Egyptian hieroglyphs are found literally all over the world, but we can also see from last week's presentation that they're also linked to the pagan symbols and to the Dogon stories, again showing a link between them. If we think about these images that we're told are Mary and the baby Jesus, and we think about the Nag Hammadi texts, I find the Nag Hammadi texts and the Dead Sea Scrolls to be very interesting. They're very mystical in the way they're written, and it seems to hint at some sort of etheric world. And certainly there are many parts of our world that seem to show a sort of other dimensional aspect to it, if you like. But the Nag Hammadi text talks about the divine Sophia, and how she created Yaldabaoth outside of the order of creation. And this was the first Archon. And essentially, Yaldabaoth was ignorant of the higher divine realms. He was arrogant, and he believed himself to be the only god. So we could see that Yaldabaoth is also the same as Satan. It sounds the same as the Jackal as well. It could also sound the same as Yahweh, as Enlil, as any of these sort of stories that we've heard about in our texts. Again, sort of, asking the question, are any of these stories actually real, or are they metaphors? And if so, has our world simply been hijacked because the energy has been hijacked? Our consciousness has been hijacked. Here we have Isis and Horus, which we can see as the Mary and Jesus. The early Madonna and child statues mirrored Isis and Horus. And because the ancient Egyptians came first, we can see that the Isis and Horus story came first as well. The story is of a child in danger protected by the Sacred Mother. And in the oldest images, we can see the same suckling of an infant, which moved into a much older infant as the statues changed. So as they became more and more into modern day, the infant started to look older and older. And we've got these three images down here. These are said to be some of the oldest images of Mary and the baby Jesus. And this one we have in the middle here. Not only does that look like either a male or an androgynous female, but this is not an infant that is being held here. And certainly the infant is doing some weird hand sign with its hands as well. We've got this earlier one here, which you can see is a baby. And then we've got this one, a very early one here, which is, again, you can see a baby and you can see the Mary, the mother here with the baby infant. We know that the mother images suckling an infant go back at least 10,000 years, but also maybe 20,000 years if we consider the Ubaid statue. And that's the Ubaid statue here, which is the one that Shannon Dory believes is the Nummo. And you can see here that it is being breastfed. So the Ubaid culture is said to go back 20,000 years, but carbon dating is very inaccurate. So we don't know whether that's exactly true, but it does show us that it goes back an awful long way. And before the Mary and Jesus stories, and also the Isis and Horus stories as well. Again, I don't believe the timelines and time periods that we're told about, but it is, I think, quite helpful to just understand if there's any sort of order at all within that. But I think probably what all these different statues are telling us is that we had a matriarchal society going back thousands of years and something changed. If we think back to the first slide, when we had the Sumerian kings list, if we think about it being a Shah, then it's 1283. Perhaps is that when the patriarchs actually descended? And that's when they infiltrated into a one world civilization, matriarchal society that was very highly energetically advanced, that was possibly a spiritual etheric realm of itself. It's working with the divine energies of the universe, with the divine laws of the universe, with the spiritual energies of the sky, of the earth, which we'll come to in a minute. Is that what happened? The patriarchs ascended from the sky and essentially blasted many of the ley lines, many of the buildings, upsetting key fundamental buildings which held the realm in place, and essentially disabling the entire civilization, because it was a one world civilization connected through power, connected through grid lines, connected through planetary energies. And by targeting specific parts of those grid lines, they could actually disable the entire civilization very, very quickly. Another thing to consider is that the subconscious mind only understands images and pictures. So possibly it is the imagery and the pictures that helped human consciousness to create a certain reality. And in this case, it was a matriarchal society, a one world civilization, which I do feel were connected through natural laws, through God's law, through pagan beliefs. I don't think that paganism is what we're told it is, but I do feel that when we connect to our intuition, when we connect to our hearts, we can feel the moral code. We can feel the ethical code. We do know the difference between right and wrong. We talked about the New Testament stories before, but essentially the New Testament stories are found everywhere. They are Horus, Attis, Mithras, Krishna, Dionysus, and Jesus. It's all the same. So we know that the Jesus stories are not Jesus stories. We know this. We know that these are stories that have been used to create a storyline in order to hijack the consciousness of the people. And certainly when you look at the Old Testament, I don't think that you could use the Old Testament to hijack the consciousness of anybody, even though the Old Testament is said to have been written after the New Testament. I don't think that one could use the Old Testament to hijack the consciousness of people who followed a moral compass, who had a strong ethical and moral code. You couldn't use the Old Testament to do that. So the New Testament has been created as a much nicer book. I suspect that they took the original book, the handbook of civilization, if you like, the beliefs of the people, the beliefs of how to have a happy life. I've always felt that the Bible is a self-help book. So they took that book and they altered and took things out and added things in order to invert it. And I do believe that the Abrahamic religions have been massively inverted by a patriarch god who seems to like sacrifice and satanic ritual. I'm not saying it's real. I'm not saying that what they're worshipping is actually a thing, because I understand about egregores and thought forms. You don't need to worship a being. You just need to put the energy into that ritual. If you add blood in, it turns it into black magic. And then you create an egregore. You create a thought form, you create an entity. And you put the power into that entity, and that alone would be enough to give power to people to be able to win wars and dominate the world. We also know that Atlantis led into Egypt and possibly Babylon as well, but maybe an inversion of Atlantis went into Babylon. The Egyptians were said to be a massively spiritual people and worked with the spiritual energies of the cosmos. They were described by Herodotus as being highly spiritual and healthy and happy. In the book Biogeometry, Back to a Future for Mankind by Dr. Abraham Karim, he talks about his research because he discovered that there are sacred power spots on Earth and in the sky that seem to mirror and correlate with each other, that manifest what he calls BG3 subtle energy quality. He discovered this spiritual energy by recording the frequencies emitting from the tombs of saints. And this suggests that saints, just like yogis, had become enlightened before death and thus were vibrating at a higher frequency. But when he found these frequencies, he then found this same energy at sacred sites, ancient temples, and megalithic dolmen. And he believes that this multidimensional property of energy opens doorways to other realms, thus enhancing communication with other dimensions and making these places sacred to our ancestors. And this is what we would call portals today. But portals are not necessarily places to go. They're different frequencies, other dimensions. And again, they may be places that we go, but they don't have to be places that we go. The thing that biogeometry shows us the most is that the earth and the sky work together. And I think most of us can see this already. We can see that the old world architecture, it links the earth and the ley lines to the sky. And what Dr. Abraham Karim is calling spiritual energies. This spiritual energy shows us that these hotspots are connected to other dimensions of time and space. And as this spiritual energy seeps through into ours, it brings information, which the quantum physicists would call bundles of data, and the spiritualists would call light codes. And this explains why people used to use these places for healing, because higher frequency energy is healing energy. In the increasing studies of underground water, which has nothing to do with our rain system, it also shows higher frequencies in our surface water, suggesting that spiritual energy comes from inside the earth as well as the sky. And this is why I feel that Earth is multidimensional and not fixed, or at least it wasn't when we weren't fixed either. Everything was etheric in our past, and the gods used to be here because everything was alive. We know that people used to talk to these gods, have physical conversations with them, and these gods spoke back. And if we think about the giant faces that we see all around the world, and we look at the mountains now, we can see entire islands look like the body of a giant. We can see these giants everywhere, but we can also see that they're made of stone. So is this showing us that our world was more etheric? Our world was multidimensional, and the people used to talk to these gods, these stone beings that we can see. They used to talk to them because our world was not fixed. And these giant faces in the rock seem to show that our consciousness shifted. They're still there. Our consciousness shifted. And we moved into a linear thinking, which is why I'm beginning to wonder if time trapped us. Because time and space just means empty void. Time is consciousness. We can see with the secret space programs that time is something that we can travel. Our ancestors built these spiritually magnifying buildings on this land and connected it with the sky. And they linked it to other dimensions outside of this time space. He goes on to say that our ancestors also connected these power spots through straight paths to connect 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional grids of BG3. And this is what we would call ley lines today, or even planetary grids. And we know that star forts, sacred places, pyramids, and old world buildings, such as cathedrals, have been built where these ley lines cross. And for me, it is saying that our universe is multidimensional and consists of different frequencies of time and space that we used to be a lot more connected to than we are today. Our consciousness shifted and we forgot, and it possibly shifted because our beliefs changed. And our matriarchal society was changed by the beliefs of the patriarchal religions. But equally, we can see that parts of our world have been decimated by what we would probably call thermonuclear bombs. There's signs of huge amounts of radiation in many parts of the world. We think about Egypt, Australia, the Middle East, parts of America. It's now just desert, really sandy, rocky desert. And what would probably have been lush and green before, the Sahara Desert was apparently lush and green as little as 500 years ago. And if we think about the true dates of the Sumerian Kings list coming in only 700 years ago, is that what we're looking at here? If everything is about consciousness and vibrational frequency, nothing is fixed, and human consciousness creates reality with the energies of the cosmos and multidimensional planes of existence, then we can work with these energies too, just like the Egyptians did, just like the old world did. I've been asked lately by a few people if I believe that Jesus lived. And I don't know, but I don't think he was called Jesus. What I can see is that the word Christ is certainly a very interesting word indeed. And the name Yeshua, which is possibly what he would have been called, living in that part of the world, may have been a man that lived. But the name means Yahweh saves, which is exactly what it does, because words hold power. We know that the English language has been altered so many times over the past few decades because they're altering the language, they're inverting it, they're turning it into black magic, they're using the words to alter our consciousness, because when we speak, we create reality with our words, thoughts, feelings, emotions. So the name of Yeshua, meaning Yahweh saves, might exactly be that. The name or word of Christ can actually release demonic possession and heal people. And I've seen this happen. I also sometimes use the Christ consciousness. And just like the Egyptians worked with the spiritual energies of the sky, we can use different energies, frequencies to heal parts of our body, to heal others, to release demonic possession. And demons are not what the Hollywood movies tell us they are. They're most likely egregores, thought forms, elementals, and they can cause illness and disease, sickness in people, but they also can be got rid of. So if we see Jesus Christ or Christ as a consciousness, then this is an energy that we can all use if we want. In the work of Aaron Torreson, his translocation modality, he shows that pushing demons out of people's bodies doesn't work because they'll just enter into someone else and cause havoc there as well. What he uses is the infinite love of Christ to heal the demon, and they disappear. So this doesn't mean that Christ is not a physical being and Jesus wasn't a physical being, but it does show that it's a consciousness, and we can all access consciousness. We can access the consciousness of the Pleiadians, the consciousness of the Arcturians. Consciousness is everything. Consciousness creates reality. It literally is everything. So everything has a consciousness. And in my opinion, the biggest trap now is materialism, because everything is being done to keep us trapped in a worldview that stops us waking up to the real truth, which is that we are spiritual beings ourselves. we are just being continually trapped into materialism. So the concept of space, the concept of extraterrestrials, and all sorts of things that are happening now, it's all, I think, being manipulated to stop us from understanding that we're spiritual beings having a physical experience, that this isn't a physical realm, this is an etheric realm. And I think when we look at the images here, we can see that as we expand our awareness and move into a new epoch, we connect back with this multidimensional field where we are also multidimensional beings. Everything is consciousness, and consciousness is alive. The universe is all around us, and we can access it through our own minds or consciousness, as the Montauk experiments showed us. So in the Montauk experiments, they retrieved a chair from one of the crash sites, maybe Roswell or maybe somewhere else, but they essentially retrieved this chair, and they understood that the chair is how the person or the being drove the craft. And they took this chair and they used a secret space soldier with high psychic awareness, who they put in the Montauk chair. And as this person was trying to work this chair, essentially, they materialized a monster, which looked like a Sasquatch, but they materialized a monster from nowhere. Now, we could say that he manifested this into being, and certainly, we could look at it like that. But when we consider that everything exists in the quantum fields, which is where we manifest from, are we creating a monster, or are we pulling in something from another dimension? Because quantum physicists have been doing this for decades as well. They've also been creating objects in another dimension and pulling it into physicality, which is exactly what he did. So dimensions are not necessarily places to go, but they can be. But they are all around us, and they're what we'd call infinite frequencies. CERN has also done this as well, and they opened up a portal to another dimension and pulled in a huge monster, which was actually seen by many locals outside CERN. This is the real reason for CERN. They're trying to access portals. They're trying to open other dimensions, because they want to understand more about how to travel through time and space, how to travel through other dimensions. It is a multidimensional place, and we can travel through with our consciousness, which is exactly what this being had done with the Montauk chair, and is exactly why UFOs are most likely plasma consciousness. We can also see in the Philadelphia experiment, where they were trying to time travel into the future, and they apparently made this happen. But I suspect that the real reason was that they wanted to open up a portal to another dimension as well. So time is also another dimension, as well as space, as we've seen with the Skinwalker Ranch. The US military have been experimenting with dimensional travel for decades, which shows that we live in a multidimensional realm and are not as fixed as we believe. Consciousness is everything. In the past, the gods were consciousness, and animism shows us that consciousness is alive, and we can use consciousness for healing, creation, time travel, space travel, immortality, and lots more, I expect. I do think that the more we research consciousness and plasma over the next few hundred years, the more we will begin to understand how reality works. So I feel that this matriarchal society that we see in the old world was a world where they were still connected with the divine feminine and spiritual laws of the universe, using etheric energy to power their cities, alchemy to build their buildings, create their art, and sacred geometry to heal their bodies, enhance their plants, and create a very uplifting civilization. And I think that this is not in a mystical way, but in a spiritual way. I suspect that what it's all describing is advanced technology, advanced science, consciousness. But again, that's not to say that myth and legend doesn't exist either. Everything exists in the quantum field, everything. And for me, that's where my understanding is moving to now. I hope you enjoyed this week's presentation, and I'll be putting up a new presentation soon about natural law, because it's something that we can all get involved in, and I really think that we should. It's something that I think if it's meant to be, it can spread around the world like wildfire, because it's our original law. It's so exciting, And it really gives us hope, or gives me hope, for another world that we can create ourselves and turn our backs on the people that turned our world into something that it was never meant to be. Okay. All right. Take care for now. Lots of love. Bye.